Coeur Silver Hills, Idaho, October 1908. The air, already thin at 4,000 feet, carried the sharp, metallic scent of coming frost and the resinous tang of lodgepole pine. Below the jagged line of the Bitterroots, the valley was a riot of gold aspen and dark fir. But up here, where the claims were scratched into the granite ribs of the mountains, the world was rock and ambition. And on a small, cleared ledge overlooking a steep canyon, Anže Završnik was engaged in an act of profound and visible foolishness. He was moving a house, or rather, he was moving what was to become his house. A colossal, rust-red iron cylinder, a decommissioned smelter tank, 12 feet in diameter and 22 feet long. It lay on its side like a fallen god of industry, its half-inch iron skin pitted and stained, its lines of rivets marching in grim precision along its seams. With a complex arrangement of log rollers, hemp rope, and 2 straining draft horses, Anže was coaxing the great beast, inch by painful inch, toward a dark cleft in the granite cliff face behind his plot. The work was slow, loud, and the subject of considerable local entertainment. A small gallery of off-shift miners and prospectors had gathered to watch. Among them, leaning against a ponderosa pine with his arms crossed, was Llewellyn Burkhart, the silver claim assessor for the district. Burkhart was a man whose authority came from his transit and his ledger. He understood geology, geometry, and the unforgiving calculus of profit and loss. He did not understand this. "He means to live in it," said Silas Croft, a lanky timberman, stating the obvious with a tone of disbelief, like a badger in a culvert. Jedediah Pike, a farmer whose land abutted the mining claims, spat a stream of tobacco juice. "It'll be an icebox by November and a coffin by January. Iron draws the cold. Everybody knows that." Burkhart finally pushed himself off the tree, his expression a mixture of professional pity and intellectual disdain. He walked closer, his boots crunching on the scree. He watched Anže reset a block and tackle, his movements economical and certain. The Slovenian didn't look up. "Završnik," Burkhart called out, his voice carrying the easy weight of a man used to being heard. "Have you considered what a winter's condensation will do inside that tank? You'll have black ice coating every surface. It's a mad idea." Anže Završnik paused, wiped sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand, and looked at the claim assessor. His face was broad, his eyes deep-set and patient. He said nothing. He simply turned back to his work, taking up the slack in the rope. The great cylinder groaned and shifted another few inches, its iron edge scraping against the granite. The sound echoed across the canyon. The men watching shook their heads. The man wasn't just stubborn, he was crazy. He was building his family a tomb. What did this Slovenian boilermaker, a man who spoke in clipped, sparse sentences, understand about iron capacitance and geothermal anchoring that a seasoned silver claim assessor and a whole community of experienced frontiersmen had missed? This channel is dedicated to uncovering the lost wisdom of those who survived against the odds. The story of Anže Završnik is a masterclass in seeing a problem not for what it appears to be, but for what it truly is at the level of physics. Subscribe to our channel, and I promise you will learn exactly how a cast-off piece of industrial machinery, guided by old-world knowledge, defeated one of the worst winters on record. Let us know in the comments, what's the most unconventional shelter you've ever seen? Anže Završnik was not a carpenter. He was not a farmer, nor was he a miner in the Idaho sense of the word. His hands, thick and scarred, did not know the intimate grain of wood or the heft of a pickaxe. They knew the unyielding reality of iron. He was from Idrija, in the Carniolan region of what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a town that owed its existence to a single, toxic substance, mercury. For 15 years, Anže had worked as a boilermaker, fabricating the massive iron ore roasters and condensing chambers for the Idrija mercury works. His trade was a constant battle against immense heat and invisible poison. He riveted half-inch plate, sealed seams against the corrosive vapor of cinnabar, and learned the deep, slow language of how metal holds and releases energy. His world was one of furnace chambers, retort vessels, and the precise tolerances required to keep a deadly gas contained under pressure. He understood that a well-made vessel was a world unto itself, a sealed system that obeyed its own rules. He had brought his wife, Katerina, and their two small children, Luca and Sofia, to the Coeur hills, not for silver, but for air. The mine doctors in Idrija had spoken of the miner's tremble and the slow decay of the lungs. They came to Idaho for the clean, sharp wind and the promise of a life built with their own hands. Their first winter in 1907 was a brutal education. They lived in a hastily built cabin of green pine, the kind that dotted the hillsides all over the Silver Valley. It was a structure designed to be built fast, not to be lived in well. The experience had been a litany of small, accumulating miseries that amounted to a singular, profound failure. Anže, the man who could seal a vessel against 600 degrees Celsius, could not keep his family warm. He remembered the specific moments of defeat with a clarity that shamed him. The well rope, soaked from Katerina's morning pull, freezing into a solid, unbendable rod before she could lower the bucket again. The tin of ground beef she'd prepared for the evening meal, left on the kitchen counter, discovered cured into a dark red brick of ice, the fat congealed into white stone. He remembered trying to curry their lone horse and hearing the hairs of the brush snap like tiny icicles instead of bending. Luca had a cough that lasted from December to March, a dry, rattling sound that seemed to echo the drafts whistling through the chinking. They had survived, but they had not lived. They had endured. Anže had watched Katerina's face grow tight with worry and seen his children huddled by a fire that consumed wood with monstrous appetite but gave back only a fleeting, localized warmth. He had failed them. This second winter would be different. He would not build with wood, a material he did not trust. He would build with what he knew. He would build with iron. The failure of the standard frontier cabin was not a failure of effort, but a failure of physics. The men who built them were skilled with an axe and an adze, but they were fighting a war against thermodynamics with the wrong weapons. The typical cabin in the Coeur district was a single-walled box made of logs, often milled flat on two sides, stacked and chinked with a mixture of mud, moss, and horsehair. The problem wasn't the cold outside. The problem was the complete lack of thermal mass inside. A fire in a cast iron stove is a powerful source of radiant and convective heat. It warms the air molecules in the cabin, causing them to zip around frantically. But the cabin itself, the structure, remained cold. The thin wooden walls, with an R value of perhaps 1 per inch, did almost nothing to stop that heat from escaping. Worse, the constant drafts from poorly sealed windows, doors, and the gaps between the logs created a relentless cycle of air exchange. Hot air, being less dense, rose to the ceiling and leaked out through the roof, while dense freezing air poured in through the floorboards to replace it. A family like the Pikes, Ange's nearest neighbors, might burn through a quarter cord of wood in a week of bitter cold, with the patriarch, Jedediah, spending most of his waking hours felling, splitting, and hauling fuel. Yet inside their cabin, the battle was never won. The air a few feet from the stove might be tolerable, but the walls themselves were cold enough to form a skin of frost on the interior. Water left in a bucket overnight would be solid by morning. It was a life spent in a constant state of thermal siege, huddled around the stove, wearing coats indoors, always feeding a fire that was heating the Idaho wilderness. More than their own small home, The core issue was that the heat had nowhere to go, nowhere to be stored. Once the fire died down, the temperature inside the cabin plummeted to match the outside temperature within an hour or two. The structure had no memory of warmth. Angie, watching the Pike's chimney belch a thick column of smoke day and night, saw not a cozy hearth, but a desperate, inefficient hemorrhage of energy. He knew that heating air was a fool's game. Air is a terrible container for heat. You had to heat something solid, something dense. You had to build a battery for warmth. The work began in late August, when he secured the decommissioned smelter tank from the defunct Morning Mine for $12. It was considered scrap, destined to be cut up and shipped out. Getting it to his claim was the first challenge. It weighed nearly 4 tons. Anže spent a week clearing a path using levers, log rollers, and the patient, immense strength of his 2 horses, Boris and Gregor. The forest echoed with the screech of iron on wood, and Ange's quiet, steady commands in his native Slovenian. Once on his ledge, the real work started. He spent days inside and out, cleaning the tank of its chemical residue, his hammer ringing against the rivets as he tested every single seam. Then came the coating. He purchased 4 gallons of red lead primer, a toxic, heavy paint known for its supreme ability to bond with and protect iron from corrosion. He painted it on in thick, careful layers under the late summer sun, turning the dull, rusted cylinder into a vibrant, almost lurid object against the gray granite and green pine. It was during this phase that Llewellyn Burkhart made his most pointed and professional objection. He'd come by with 2 men from the assay office, ostensibly to survey a new claim marker nearby, but their real purpose was clear. Burkhart walked around the gleaming red tank, his hands on his hips. "Završnik," he began without preamble. "I was an engineer at a silver refinery in Nevada before I took this post. I know what that coating is, red lead. And I know what this tank was used for." He tapped the iron flank with a knuckle. It rang with a deep, resonant hum. "It's a smelter tank. It's been saturated with years of ore processing. Cinnabar, arsenic, lead, antimony. You heat this cylinder from the inside, and that red lead coating will sublimate the residual heavy metals right into your air. It's a slow poison. Your family will be breathing lead vapor by Easter." He delivered the lines with the cool certainty of an expert witness, his 2 companions nodding gravely. It was a damning, technical, and entirely logical critique. Ange finished his brushstroke, carefully wiping the excess paint on the lip of the can. He looked at Burkhart, his gaze steady. "It is sealed," he said. He had spent a week with a wire brush and lye scouring the iron down to its clean, raw state before the first primer coat went on. He knew his work. He knew his seals. He turned back to his painting, a silent dismissal more profound than any argument. Burkhart stared at the Slovenian's back for a long moment, then snorted in disgust and walked away. The word spread quickly through the camps. The crazy Slovenian wasn't just building a coffin, he was building a gas chamber. With the painting done, the final move began. Ange positioned the tank at the mouth of the granite alcove. The hollow was a natural formation, a place where a softer pocket of rock had eroded out of the cliff face, leaving a cavity roughly 13 feet wide and extending some 30 feet deep. Using his winches and rollers, he slid the tank 18 feet into the darkness of the mountain itself until only 4 feet of the cylinder protruded from the rock. The final step was to build the front wall. He didn't use logs. He and Katerina spent 2 weeks hauling gravel from the creek bed, mixing it with sand and cement to create a thick, heavy mortar. They built a form and poured a solid, 2-foot-thick plug that sealed the mouth of the alcove around the protruding end of the tank, embedding a sturdy door frame and a small square window frame into the structure. The only other opening was the stovepipe, which Anže carefully routed from the small cast iron stove inside up through a natural fissure in the granite overhead, sealing it with yet more mortar. When he was done, the strange dwelling looked less like a house and more like a bank vault or a munitions bunker, with a bright red iron tunnel disappearing into the heart of the mountain. Katerina, looking at the odd structure, had only one comment. "It is not pretty, Anže," she said, her voice neutral. "No," he agreed. "It is not for pretty. It is for warm." To understand why Anže Završnik's iron cylinder worked, you have to understand two fundamental principles the frontiersmen missed: thermal capacitance and geothermal anchoring. Their entire approach was based on insulation, trying to stop the cold from getting in. Ange's approach was based on storage, creating a massive, stable reservoir of warmth. First, thermal capacitance. This is the ability of a material to store heat energy. Different materials have different capacities. Air, for instance, has a very low specific heat capacity. It takes very little energy to raise its temperature, but it also holds that energy for a very short time. Wood is better, but iron is in another league entirely. A pound of iron can store almost 10 times the amount of heat as a pound of air. Ange's smelter tank, at 12 feet in diameter, 22 feet long, with a half-inch skin, had a surface area of over 800 square feet and a total weight of nearly 8,000 pounds. It was, in effect, a massive iron battery. The card's figure of 9,000 BTUs per linear foot is a stunning measure of this capacity. A British thermal unit, or BTU, is the amount of energy needed to raise 1 pound of water by 1 degree Fahrenheit. Ange's 22-foot tank could therefore store nearly 200,000 BTUs of energy in its iron skin. When he lit a fire in the small stove inside, he wasn't just heating the air. He was slowly, steadily charging this immense thermal battery. The heat radiated from the stove, was absorbed by the iron walls, and held there. After a few hours of a modest fire, the entire mass of the cylinder would be saturated with warmth. When the fire died down, the process reversed. The iron, now warmer than the air, began to radiate its stored energy back into the living space. It would continue to do so for hours, even days. The card estimates a 30-hour release after a single fire, a performance utterly unimaginable in a log cabin, which would be frigid an hour after the last ember died. The second principle, and arguably the more brilliant, was geothermal anchoring. Any structure built on the surface of the earth in an Idaho winter is sitting on frozen ground. The frozen earth acts as a colossal heat sink, constantly pulling warmth out of the floor of the cabin. It's a battle you can never win. But Anže knew that the earth is only frozen for the first few feet. Below the frost line, the ground maintains a remarkably stable temperature year-round, a temperature that reflects the region's average annual air temperature. In the Coeur hills, this was about 46 degrees. By sliding 18 feet of his iron cylinder deep into the granite alcove, Anže wasn't just protecting it from the wind. He was physically coupling his home to the deep, stable warmth of the planet. The back 3/4 of his house could never, under any circumstances, drop below 46 degrees. The mountain itself was his insulation and his baseline heat source. Instead of losing heat to the frozen ground like his neighbors, Ange's home was constantly gaining a small, steady trickle of warmth from the rock it was nestled in. He had eliminated the single biggest source of heat loss that plagued conventional cabins. His home didn't fight the mountain, it borrowed its eternal, deep-set warmth. That November, winter arrived not as a gradual decline, but as a sudden, brutal assault. A high-pressure system settled over the northern Rockies, pinning a mass of Arctic air against the mountains. It was a classic Bitterroot inversion. For 14 straight days, the temperature at the valley floor never rose above -30 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was perfectly still, preternaturally clear on the ridges, but choked with a thick, stagnant layer of wood smoke in the canyons below. From the high claims, you could look down and see the smoke from 100 cabins pooled into a visible, suffocating blanket 80 feet deep, a gray testament to the desperate, losing battle for warmth being waged below. For the Pike family, it was a nightmare. The cold was a physical presence, a predator. The new chinking they'd put in that fall had shrunk, opening up a dozen tiny cracks that admitted knives of frigid air. They kept the stove roaring white-hot, but the heat barely reached the corners of the single room. The windows were opaque with an inch of interior ice. At night they slept in their coats, under a pile of every blanket they owned. Jedediah's prized bottle of whiskey, kept on a shelf away from the stove, had turned to a thick, viscous slush that had to be spooned out and thawed before it could be drunk. It was a life reduced to the bare essentials of survival, feeding the fire and enduring the cold. Inside Anže Završnik's iron cylinder, life continued with an impossible normalcy. The small stove was fed a few logs in the morning and a few in the evening. The air inside was a steady, comfortable 65 degrees. There was no frost on the single small window pane. There were no drafts. The thick mortar wall and the deep-set iron tube were silent, impervious. The most remarkable thing was the lack of drama. Katerina sat near the door, mending one of Luca's shirts, her fingers nimble and bare. The children played on a wool rug on the floor, drawing pictures on a slate. The air smelled faintly of baking bread and drying herbs, not of the acrid smoke that choked the valley. Anže sat at a small table, oiling a tool. On a small ledge carved into the granite, deep inside the hollow beside the iron wall, sat a clear glass flask of slivovica, the potent plum brandy of his homeland. He stood, took the flask, and poured a small measure into a glass. The liquid flowed clear and free, as if it were a summer afternoon. At 60 degrees Fahrenheit, it was perfectly preserved, a liquid testament to the stable warmth of the deep earth. He had not built a shelter. He had built a different season. The breaking point for Lowell and Burkhart came on the 10th day of the inversion. He and a 3-man survey crew were working a high pyrite claim on the far side of the canyon, a miserable job in the crushing cold. The air was so frigid that the steel of their transit was painful to touch, and their breath froze instantly on their beards. They finished their work as the weak, late afternoon sun began to dip below the western ridge and started their descent. Darkness fell with the swift, unforgiving finality of a mountain winter. The world dissolved into a featureless landscape of snow and rock. Worse, as they dropped in altitude, they entered the thick, disorienting layer of wood smoke. Visibility dropped to less than 20 feet. The smoke burned their lungs and made their eyes water. They became disoriented, losing the trail in the gloom. The temperature was now pushing -40. It was a life-threatening situation. The foreman, a man named Cobb, held up his lantern, its yellow beam swallowed by the gray murk. They were lost. Then Cobb stopped. "What in God's name is that?" he whispered. He pointed the lantern upward. Through the thick haze, they saw it. A perfectly straight, clean column of smoke, almost white, rising like a rope thrown toward the stars. It wasn't pooling or spreading. It was punching directly through the inversion layer. A beacon of impossible physics. Smoke didn't do that in this cold. The hot exhaust from a chimney should hit the frigid ceiling of the inversion layer and spread out. This smoke was too hot, its velocity too high. It was behaving as if the inversion didn't exist. Burkhart stared, his mind racing. He knew where they were, roughly. He knew whose claim this was. "Završnik," he breathed. The smoke plume was their compass. They stumbled toward it, a half-mile trek through deep snow and freezing fog. their only guide that clean, white line in the sky. They emerged from the smoke-choked trees into the clearing and saw the strange, bunker-like structure. The plume rose from a stovepipe emerging directly from the snow-covered rock above it. They were exhausted, half-frozen, and desperate. As they approached the door, Burkhart reached out a gloved hand to brace himself against the thick mortar wall. He was expecting to feel the soul-sucking cold of stone at 30 below zero. He felt warmth. It wasn't a fierce heat, but a deep, steady, and utterly impossible warmth radiating out of the wall. He pulled off his glove, pressing his bare palm against the mortared gravel. It felt like a sun-warmed rock in September. He couldn't understand it. It violated every rule of his experience. Anže opened the door, and a wave of clean, warm air washed over them, a physical shock after the biting cold. They stepped inside. The quiet domesticity of the scene was jarring. The woman mending, the children playing, the smell of bread. There was no desperate, roaring fire, only the small stove giving off a gentle heat. Burkhart's eyes scanned the interior, taking in the smooth, dry iron walls, the lack of any condensation or frost. He saw the flask of clear liquid on the stone ledge. He looked at Anže, who simply nodded, offering them seats. The claim assessor, a man of numbers and confident declarations, was speechless. He finally looked at Završnik, the fatigue and cold giving way to a profound, dawning respect. "You didn't build a cabin, Završnik," Burkhart said, his voice raspy. "You built a pulse in the stone." Llewellyn Burkhart, the loudest critic, became the innovation's most powerful advocate. A man of his standing admitting he was wrong carried more weight than any argument Anže could have made. He described what he had seen and felt that night at the assay office, at the general store, and to anyone who would listen. He spoke not of madness, but of genius. He replaced his warnings of poison with explanations of thermal mass. The true vehicle for the idea's spread, however, was the Coeur d'Alene Miners' Union. Burkhart, a respected figure, presented Ange's design to the leadership of Local 18. He sketched it out on a piece of paper: the cylinder, the rock alcove, the mortar plug, the stovepipe through the fissure. He explained the principles as best he could, emphasizing the fuel savings and the immense gain in comfort and safety. In the Union's Winter 1908 bulletin, alongside notices of dues and meeting times, was a small, hand-drawn diagram titled Završnik's Hollow. It was simple, practical, and aimed at men who understood materials and survival. The idea, planted in fertile ground, took root. The Silver Valley was littered with the detritus of played-out mines. Decommissioned boilers, ore carts, and smelter tanks were readily available. That next summer, several families took up the challenge. A Welsh family near Kellogg secured an old steam boiler. An Italian family outside of Wallace adapted a massive iron water pipe. By the winter of 1910, 5 families across the valley were living in variations of Ange's design, their homes burrowed into the hillsides, leaning on the steady warmth of the earth. They reported cutting their winter wood consumption by over 70%. More importantly, they reported winters of health and comfort, free from the relentless, exhausting siege of the cold. Anže Završnik, with no formal training in engineering or architecture, had stumbled upon principles that would not become mainstream for another 70 years. His iron cylinder in the granite hollow was a primitive, but startlingly effective form of an earth-sheltered home. His use of the massive iron tank as a thermal battery anticipated the modern concept of thermal mass heating. His coupling of the structure to the deep earth was a forerunner of geothermal exchange systems. He was a man a century ahead of his time, not through abstract theory, but through a deep, hands-on intimacy with his chosen material and a refusal to accept conventional failure. The frontier narrative is often one of conquest, of man bending nature to his will. The forests are cleared, the mountains are mined, the rivers are dammed. Survival is framed as a battle against a hostile environment. Anže Završnik's story offers a different, quieter wisdom. He didn't build a house against the mountain, a fortress to repel the cold. He taught one iron vessel to lean into the stone and borrow its warmth. His genius was not in opposition, but in alliance. He saw the mountain not as an obstacle to be overcome, but as a vast, stable reservoir of energy to be partnered with. He listened to the deep, slow language of the earth, a language he understood through the medium of his iron. He knew a vessel must be sealed to be strong, but he also knew that the greatest strength comes not from standing alone, but from anchoring to something more permanent than oneself. The cold of the Idaho winter was absolute, but the warmth of the deep earth was eternal. He simply chose which one to lean against. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this exploration of historical engineering and physics valuable, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories like it. We believe the past holds lessons that are more relevant than ever. Let us know in the comments. What other modern architectural concepts do you see foreshadowed in historical survival techniques? The content of this video is for educational and storytelling purposes. It presents a fictionalized narrative inspired by historical practices and engineering principles. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are products of creative reconstruction. While the techniques are based on real historical possibilities, any application of similar methods today should be undertaken only after consulting with qualified professionals and in accordance with all modern building codes, safety standards, and local regulations. This video does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice,